Alright, what is up everybody, and welcome to the Progressive Skills in English Level 3 coursebook. And in today's recording we're going to be going over Theme 1, Remembering and Forgetting. So before we start, here we have some of the topics that will be mentioned throughout the theme. We have memory, learner styles, improving your memory, rehearsal, and prompts. So basically things about the memory in general and how to improve it, and remembering and forgetting. Okay? So let's start with the listening memory. Here we have 1.1 real-time listening memory models. So we have exercise A, activating ideas. So basically we're just going to start with a simple warm-up here. Discuss these questions. So what are the 5 senses, you guys? I'm pretty sure everybody knows what the 5 human senses are. We have sight, basically seeing, hearing, feeling or touch, taste, and smell. Okay, although I do believe that humans have more than 5 senses, that's not today's topic. Okay, so we have seeing, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. Okay, and do you guys personally associate any of the senses with memories? I personally don't, but I'd like to hear your comments. And if you think the senses are associated with memories. Okay, now let's go to exercise B here, predicting the content of a lecture. Okay, so look at figure 1 on page 9, so that's the next page. Think about the answers to these questions. What is the lecture going to be about? Okay, so what I want to tell you guys is basically when you're about to read something, an article, anything basically, you gotta ask yourself before you start reading, what is the article going to be about, right? So, or let's say, for example, if a lecturer gives you a topic, right, and he's going to start talking about it next Tuesday, for example, you gotta ask yourself, what is the lecturer going to say? Okay, so you gotta ask yourself these questions to get yourself in the habit of, it helps with retaining information as well. Okay, so what is the lecturer going to talk about? Let's take a look. So here we have the multi-store memory model. Okay. That's obviously the name of the people that invented this, I'm guessing, the memory model. So Atkinson, Sheffrin, 1968. Then we have sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Okay, so it looks like the lecture is going to be about the different types of memories, and basically I'm guessing this is sort of an experiment to test someone's memory. I'm not too sure, but at least it's a start. Okay, so then we have, according to figure 1, how many different types of memory are there? And we can see we have 3 types of memory. So we have sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Okay, and what is sensory memory? So since I don't know the lecture yet, I think that sensory memory is basically a thought that pops in, or something that someone says that stays in your head for 1 to 3 seconds, right? But we'll get back to that. Okay, so now let's go to, or actually before we do that, we have the vocab box, and I want you guys to always write down these words. Okay, so you guys can improve your vocab and try to improve your pronunciation as well. So pronounce it after me, and if you have any trouble pronouncing said words, please just rewind the video and do it again. Okay, so we have classmate, encode, experiment, find/found, findings, long-term, model, publish, recognize, report, sensory, set, short-term, sound. Okay, you guys? So here we have exercise C, understanding key information. Let me open this so you guys can get a better look. Okay, so we have 1.1, listen to the lecture. Okay, so now we have a 4-minute audio, right? And then after that we have, can you remember any other information about each sentence? Okay, so we have some sentences here, and we're gonna match them with the correct piece of information, right? And we'll see if we can remember any other information about some extra sentences here. Okay, so here, have a listen.
Track 1.1. Hello. Now, in this lecture, we are going to look at a very important process. It's the process of getting new information into long-term memory. Now, there are several memory models that different researchers have discussed, but we're only going to look at one model today. It's the multi-store memory model. Firstly, we'll look at the components of the model. Then we'll see how information moves through the different parts of the brain according to the model. So first, let's look at the components of the multi-store memory model. It was proposed by two researchers called Atkinson and Shiffrin, and they wrote an article in 1968. It was entitled The Psychology of Learning and Motivation. In the article, Atkinson and Shiffrin say that there are three parts to memory. Firstly, there is sensory memory. The word sensory is the adjective from sense. It means related to sight, hearing, and so on. Now, sensory memory lasts from 1 to 3 seconds. The second part of the multi-store model is short-term memory. Short-term memory lasts from 15 to 30 seconds. And finally, we have long-term memory. Now, long-term memory can last a lifetime. Okay. Now, let's consider how information moves through the three parts of the memory. First, sensory memory. All 5 senses can lead to memories. For example, we use sight for recognizing people. We use hearing for recognizing a piece of music. Atkinson and Shiffrin say that we must pay attention to a piece of sensory information to move it into short-term memory. So, for example, our eyes see a telephone number. Now, we only put it into short-term memory when we actually look at it. So the first stage of memory is paying attention. When we pay attention, we move information. It goes from sensory memory to short-term memory. But short-term memory doesn't last for long. We must do something with the information in short-term memory. If we don't, new information from sensory memory pushes out old information. And the best-known research in this area was conducted by Miller. In 1956, he wrote an article which was called The Magical Number 7, Plus or Minus 2. In the article, Miller says that short-term memory can only hold about 7 pieces of meaningless information. For example, it can hold a telephone number. When an 8th piece comes along, one of the 7 pieces is pushed out. Long-term memory is the final stage in this model. According to Atkinson and Shiffrin, we need rehearsal to move information from short-term memory. So in other words, we need to repeat information in our heads. We need to say it again and again, and perhaps again. Then it will be moved from short-term to long-term memory. So that's the multi-store model. In the next lecture, we'll look at the idea of rehearsal in more detail. Is it just repetition, or is there more involved? That's next time.
Okay, so it turns out that I was actually wrong and that we can use our senses to create memories, or I should say short-term memories, right? So, for example, like the guy said, or the lecturer said, we can, use our hearing to identify music, for example, right? We can use our sight to detect our parents, celebrities, etc. Okay? So sensory memory comes from the word sense, right? And then from the sensory memory, or let me actually go and here use this. So sensory memory lasts about 1 to 3 seconds if not pushed to short-term memory, right? So if sensory memory, you have a specific memory that goes, let's say for example, a new friend, for example, right? He's sensory memory, but because you guys started talking and so on, short term, it goes to short-term memory. Not even a new friend, maybe a stranger, but you guys started talking. But I mean, you see a lot of faces every single day when you go to and from work, school, whatever, right? But all these, get flushed out sensory memory, right? They just last for a bit and boom, they're out. And if they happen to go to short-term memory, they're flushed back out when new sensory memory goes to short-term memory. So what do we do when there is short-term memory? How do we change it to a long-term memory that either lasts from 1 second to a lifetime? And that is, I think you personally just got to do the thing over and over again, right? So for example, why do you never forget who your parents are? That's because you know them, right? You've seen them ever since you were born, right? And you keep seeing them almost daily until until you become an adult. And even then, you still call them, you still visit. So it's actually impossible to forget about them, right? So that is how memory, or this memory model, works, and that is how basically Atkinson and Schifrin explained it, right? Now let's go to this exercise right here, exercise C, and I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about Miller's 7-digit theory, but that's a little bit later on. Let's start first with who proposed the multi-store memory model, and that's Atkinson and Schifrin, right? That is number 1. So who proposed the multi-store memory model? Atkinson and Schifrin. When did they do this? They did this, when did they do it? In 1968. So 1968 is when they introduced or proposed the multi-store memory model. And who conducted the research into short-term memory? And for that, we'll say Miller. Miller is the one that actually conducted research into short-term memory. And when did he do this? He did this in 1956. Right, you guys? So 1956. So now next question, how long does sensory memory last? And it lasts from 1 to 3 seconds. Okay? And how long does short-term memory last? Short-term memory lasts for around what? 15 to 30 seconds? So short-term memory lasts for 15 to 30 seconds. Now, how long does long-term memory last? And I think it lasts forever. We'll say forever, yeah. How long does it can last from 1 second to forever. And then we have H. How can we move information in sensory memory into short-term memory? And for that, we must pay attention to it, right? So it's really simple. That's why when you meet a stranger or you see a car right next to you in a red light, you kind of forget about the person the moment you guys start moving. But the second you start paying attention and probably talking to someone, that's when your sensory memory goes to short-term memory, right? And then you keep paying attention and rehearsing it over and over again, and then it goes into long-term memory. So how can we move information? We must pay attention to it. How many pieces of information can short-term memory hold? 7, right? So 7 pieces of information, and that was actually Miller's theory based on his research that every time a new memory from sensory goes to short-term, one of those 7 pieces of useless memory on short-term actually gets thrown out, right? Think of it as a really advanced computer that has its own, programming software that just automatically does all of these things without you actually noticing. Okay? And then we have, how can we move information from short-term into long-term memory? And that is by rehearsing it. That is why you'll see that, for example, if you start listening to a new song, right? And you really like the song, you'll realize that after playing it for so long, you just won't forget it. You'll know all the lyrics, or mostly all the lyrics. You'll be able to identify it by just hearing the instrument, right, or the beat. And you probably know the singer, and you'll probably never forget it unless you completely stop listening to it for the next 10 years or so. Okay, so that was that exercise. Now let's move on. Here we have D. Transferring information to the real world. Discuss the following questions. Can you think of an experiment to prove Miller's theory about the magical number 7? And we talked a little bit about Miller's theory about the magical number 7 and how every time, a piece of information or memory from sensory goes to short term, another part of memory from short term just falls away. Okay? So how do you think, guys, what do you think can be a good experiment or research to prove Miller's theory? So what do you guys think? I mean, I think you guys could probably use 7 random numbers, right? So just hear me out for a second. So we could probably show, students 7 random numbers or simple shapes, okay? And then we remove them, and after about 15 seconds, the students are asked to remember them, right? Or we ask the students to remember them in the correct order, right? And then add more numbers or shapes, right? And again and again and again, and then we will ask them to remember them after 15 to 30 seconds, and that is how we could prove Miller's theory, right? I know this could be a little bit confusing, so you can always go back and rewind to the audio if you get lost somewhere here. Okay? Then we have number 2. What relevance does the multi-store memory model have for education and learning? So basically, why is it useful? And for that, I can say, obviously answers depend on you guys, but for me, I think that this research is very important for learning, because as learners, it tells us that we must pay attention to retain information, and we actually gotta rehearse it to just get it stuck in our heads, right? So as a teacher, that means that you have to get students' attention, right? A student will never ever, have information that actually benefit him after a test if he's not interested, if he's not paying attention to you as a teacher, right? So it's your job as a teacher to get the students' attention, right? And also review and revise information correctly so that it stays in students' heads and in your head as a teacher as well, right? And especially when it's new, when a piece of information is new, like right now, you gotta, review it and go over it again and again and again, right? So yeah, that was exercise D, you guys. And yeah, now let's move on to the next page. Alright, you guys, so now let's move on to page 10, 1.2, learning new listening skills. So here we have exercise A, predicting the next information. So we're going to be listening to a part of the lecture, obviously, related to the audios that we heard in the previous pages, okay? And we're going to be correcting, or not correcting, just numbering these sentences in the correct order that we hear them, okay? So here, have a listen.
Track 1.2.
1. The model was proposed by 2. They wrote an article in 3. It was entitled 4. In the article 5. Firstly 6. Sensory is 7. Sensory means 8. Sensory memory lasts 9. The second part of the multi-store model is 10. Finally, we have
long-term memory. Okay, so basically numbering the sentence endings, okay, in the correct order. So I'll play it one more time, but I'll actually be completing the sentence as we go. Okay, here we go.
Track 1.2.
1. The model was proposed by
Atkinson and Schifrin,
2. They wrote an article in
1968.
3. It was entitled
The Psychology of Learning and Motivation.
4. In the article
Atkinson and Schifrin say that there are
5.
3 parts to memory.
Firstly,
There is sensory memory,
6. Sensory is
the adjective from sense.
7. Sensory means
Related to sight, hearing, and so on.
8. Sensory memory lasts
From 1 to 3 seconds.
9. The second part of the multi-store model is
Short-term memory.
10. Finally, we have
Long-term memory. Okay, you guys, so that was the audio and the sentence endings in the correct order. Now let's go to exercise B. So we're going to read the skills check. So here we have recording sources. So lecturers often talk about well-known researchers in a particular discipline or style. So for you, when taking notes, you must record the topic, the name of the researchers, and the date of the research. Okay, so these things are a must when writing notes down. Okay, you, however, do not have to record the name of the articles or the book, so you don't have to be way too specific with the article or the book. You can check that on the internet later on when you take a review of your notes, when you go home or whatever. Okay? So let's have an example here. We have listen to extracts from a lecture. Okay, so we're not going to be listening to this. We have an exercise later on that's really similar to this, or very similar. Okay, so this is how you write it. Check this out. So the topic, the name of the researchers, and the date of the research. Okay, so like we said, you must record these as you go. You cannot keep them for later. Or you cannot just say, oh, I'll check it later. No. When it comes to the topic, the name of the research or researchers or researches, and the date of the research itself. Okay? So now let's go to identifying a new skill. What information must you record during the lecture? We just said. So we must record the topic, the name of the researchers, and the date of the research. And then we have 2, what information can you check after the lecture or later on? And that is the exact name of the research, the exact name of a certain book or an article. Okay? Now let's go to practicing a new skill 1, exercise C. So we're going to be listening to some extracts. Let me open this. Okay, and we're going to be listening to some extracts from a lecture on memory. Okay, that's our theme. And then we're gonna be, I want you guys to take notes based on what I just told you. Okay, so you gotta write down the topic, the name of the researchers, research, and the date of the research. Okay, and then you don't have to write the exact name of the research, like we said, book or article. Okay, so here, have a listen.
Track 1.4.
1.
Short-term memory was originally called primary memory. The first real investigation of primary memory was in 1887. That's 1887, not 1987, so well over 100 years ago. A man called Joseph Jacobs conducted an experiment. He gave people sets of numbers to remember. The sets got longer and longer. Jacobs found the average is around 6 or 7.
2.
Let's see how we encode sensory information. A man called Conrad did some experiments in 1964. In an article entitled Acoustic Confusions in Immediate Memory, Conrad said that we encode sensory information as sound. But only 6 years later, in 1970, another researcher called Schulman did some more experiments. He reported his findings in the Journal of Verbal Learning and Verbal Behavior. Schulman found that some information is encoded for meaning, not sound.
3.
Peterson and Peterson published a study in 1959. It was called Short-Term Retention of Individual Verbal Items. They looked at the length of short-term memory if there was no rehearsal. Peterson and Peterson found people can remember meaningless shapes without rehearsal for about 3 seconds. But after 18 seconds, nearly everything is forgotten. Did I say the date? It was 1959.
4.
A group of researchers looked at long-term memory in 1975, I think it was. Let me check my notes. Yes, 1975. Barwick et al. Wanted to test the length of long-term memory. They showed people photographs of school classmates and asked them to recognize the people. Barak and his team found that long-term memory declines over long periods of time.
5.
Another model of memory is called the working memory model. This was proposed by Baddeley and Hitch in 1975. So that's the same year as Barak et al.'s research. Baddeley and Hitch looked mostly at short-term memory. There is one main difference between this model and the multi-store model. The working memory model suggests that short-term memory has several different parts, and each part has its own function.
Alright, so before we actually move on, I hope you're able to write some notes down like we discussed, but I want you guys to know that many lecturers actually give out the important names of researchers and other sources on their PowerPoint slides or simply in their notes for the lecture. But you gotta know that for you as a student, it's really important to be able to use the skill of listening and making your own notes, okay? It can help you even better with retaining information and later on in life, okay? And in the simple case where, for example, a lecturer does not give the information, you gotta be ready as a student, okay? So you also gotta have that confirmation, so you can't just rely on writing notes down in class and forgetting all about it and checking it, 2 days before the exam. No, you gotta, when you go home, or a different day, depends on your schedule, right? You gotta take a look and check your research, check your notes. Are they correct? Are they up to date? Anything else you'd like to add? And so on. And I know that if this is your first time taking notes, then this is probably quite a difficult task. And I'm here to reassure you that this will get better with practice, so don't get discouraged, okay? But you gotta do it. Like we said, practice makes perfect. Okay, you guys? So now let's move on. So here we have vocabulary box. Don't forget to write these down and practice your pronunciation. So we have attention, forget/forgot, involve, perform, recall, rehearsal, remember, remind, repetition, retrieve. Okay, now let's move forward. Here we have a photo of an old lady remembering her middle school days, or I don't know, is that kindergarten? I'm not too sure. So we have exercise D, identifying words from the stressed syllable. Okay, you guys, so I talked a little bit about this before, so you gotta understand the stressed part of every syllable in a word, and that comes with improving your pronunciation, obviously. So you're gonna be listening to the stressed syllable of words only, so you're not gonna hear involve, you're not gonna hear perform, you're only gonna hear the stressed syllable, okay? So I'm gonna let it play the first time, and I hope you'll be able to number these words in the correct order, and then in the second time I'll play it again and I'll number it as we go. Okay, have a listen.
Track 1.5.
1. Volve. 2. Mem. 3. Sid. 4. Rec. 5. 10. 6. Search. 7. In. 8. T. 9. Form. 10. Code. 11. Retrieve. 12. Call.
All right, I hope you were able to number them. Now I'll play it again and I'll number as we go.
Track 1.5.
1. Volve. 2. Mem. 3. Sid. 4. Rec. 5. 10. 6. Search. 7. In 8. 9. Form 10. Code 11. Retrieve 12. Call.
Okay, so 11, retrieve, had a brain freeze there for a second, and then recall will be 12. Okay, you guys? So that was identifying words simply from the stressed syllable. Okay? Now, before we move on to exercise E, let's read skills check 2. Indirect questions and direct questions. So lecturers often use indirect questions in lectures, right? So for you as a student, you must identify the direct question to get the heading of your notes, right? We talked about how getting the heading of your notes is important. So lecturers, when they're talking, when they're explaining, they'll say things in the indirect questions form. All right, so for example, we'll see if rehearsal is just repetition. I will see that's a question, but it's an indirect question. But the direct question for that is rehearsal just repetition? So you got to be able to change indirect questions to direct ones, okay? So let's consider how the process works. For that, to turn it into a direct question, we'll say, how does the process work? Okay? So now let's go to, let me actually check here. We have exercise E, the subject before the verb. So what is the subject before the verb, you guys? What do you guys think? Is there a subject before the verb? That's correct. The subject is before the verb, right? And then we have a question word or if. So we talked about question words. Do direct questions and indirect questions, do they have, question words? So for example, what, who, where, why, how, or the word if? And that's correct. You can clearly see that we have if and not a question word. All right? And we have an auxiliary word. So for example, the word does. And no, we do not. So for indirect questions, we do not have auxiliary word. We have F, and there's a subject before the verb. Okay? Now let's practice our new skill. Let me actually open this. Okay, so we're going to be listening to some indirect questions, okay? So I want you guys to pause as many times as you need, okay? And make a heading for your notes in each case. So you'll have possibly different cases here in this audio, okay? And I'll let it play the first time, and then I'll actually make my own headings as we go as well, okay? So here, have a listen.
Track 1.6.
1. I'm going to discuss how we encode sensory information. 2. We'll see what the researchers discovered. 3. I'm going to explain why this research is important. 4. Let's consider how this happens. 5. We'll find out who the famous people are in this area. 6. Let's consider how many pieces of information we can remember in short-term memory. 7. I'll explain why this research is important for learners. 8. We'll look at how information moves through the brain.
Alright, you guys, so we had 8 different cases in this audio right here. So before we move on, I want you guys to know that when writing a heading for your notes, it doesn't necessarily have to be understandable for other people. Let me elaborate a little bit. So for example, we have the first case. I'm going to discuss how we encode sensory information. I wrote how/encode sense and then INF question mark. So you're probably listening to me weird right now, like, what is he saying? I don't get it. And I understand, hey. But for me, what that means is, how does how do we encode sensory information? I'm just writing things in short form. Why? To save time. You gotta be quick, you gotta be swift when writing notes, especially during a lecture that's gonna be going on for, like, I'd say 2 hours, right? You gotta be fast. That's why a lot of people, I know it's obviously personal preference, but most people that use laptops when taking notes are really quick when typing, okay? So there are obviously different styles to taking notes, but I find that skipping some of the spellings, and you don't need to write the question exactly as it is in your head. Just write a shorter version of it, and then when you go home, take another look at your notes, and you can correct any mistakes if you had any, and basically get things to look a little bit better. Okay, so we had case number 1. I'm going to discuss how we encode sensory information, and for that, for me, I said how encode sense, full stop, and then information, question mark. Okay, then case number 2, we'll see what the researchers discovered, and for that I wrote what / res, as in researchers, right? But I had to save time, and then discover, question mark, as in discovered. What did they discover, or we'll see what they discovered. Then we have case number 3. I'm going to explain why this research is important, and for that I wrote why, right? Why, RES, as in research, IMP, as in important. I really, I was hoping that I could write this for you guys, but there's no space here, so we're gonna have to do this orally. Alright, so we have case number 4 now. Let's consider how this happens. And for that, I just wrote a simple how / happens, question mark. Okay? And then moving on to case number 5, we'll find out who the famous people are in this area. And for that, for my note heading, I wrote people in area, question mark. Might not make sense, might look like broken English, but you guys gotta remember, we'll fix it later on. And then we have number 6. Let's consider how many pieces of information we can remember in short-term memory. And for that, I wrote how many pieces, INF, information in SHT, as in short-term, MEM, as in memory. Okay? And then question mark. And then we have case number 7. I'll explain why this research is important for learners. And for that, I wrote why IMP, as in important for learners. And then finally, case number 8, we'll look at how information moves through the brain. And for that, I wrote how INF, as in information, moves through the brain. Okay? So, trust me, you'll get better with time for your notes, but you gotta practice, you guys. Okay? Now, let's move on to the next page. Alright, you guys, so now let's move on to exercise G, making direct and indirect questions. And we talked a little bit about direct and indirect questions in the previous pages, right? So in this exercise, we're going to be reading the questions and statements below. So we have 2 sections for this exercise here. So the first section, he wants us to write these indirect questions, or for these statements below, we're going to write direct questions for each, right? So we have A, I don't know if he's English. And if we want to turn that into a direct question, how would we say it, guys? We'll say, is he English? Right? Question mark. I don't know if he's English. Is he English? Question mark. Okay. And then we have B, I'm not sure if the lecture is in room 3. And direct question, is the lecture in room 3? Straight to the point, direct. And then we have C, I've forgotten if we have a test this week. And for that, I'd say just a simple question, do we, right, have a test this week? Okay, you guys? And then we have D, do you know where she lives? Do you know where she lives? Right? For that, I'd say, where does she live? I know this one was probably a little bit confusing for you guys. So, do you know where she lives? Where does she live? Straight to the point. Okay, direct question. Then we have E. Have you got any idea when the talk finishes? So, I can actually write it in two different ways here. I can say, when does the talk finish? Or I can also say, when will the talk finish? So I'll just go with when, right? When does the talk finish? Okay? Now let's move on. Not exercise F. I'm going to discuss how children learn. I can just say, how do children learn? Okay? And then we have G. First, we'll see what Aristotle thought. Okay? And I could say, what did... Oh, let me write that in capital. Aristotle think. Okay? Question mark. So what did Aristotle think? Then we have H. Then I'll tell you how Piaget researched this subject. And if I want to ask a direct question, I'll say, can you, or not can you, no, I'm not going to say it. I'm going to say it like this. How did Piaget research, right, this subject? Okay, you guys? So, let's go with the direct questions again. Is he English? Is the lecture in room 3? Do we have a test this week? Where does she live? When does the talk finish? How do children learn? What did Aristotle think? How did Piaget research this subject? Alright, let's go to the second part of this exercise now. Turn these direct questions into indirect questions by using these phrases. So, can you tell me? And then we move on. Do you know? Then we keep going. Or have you got any idea? So we have direct questions now, and we're going to have to turn them into the indirect ones. Okay, so we have A. Is the lecture about Piaget? And if I want to turn that into an indirect question, I'll probably say, can you tell me if the lecture... Can you tell me if the lecture is about Piaget? Okay? So let me actually write that in capital. About Piaget. Now let's go to B. Who is the lecture about? Okay? I'll say, have you got any idea who the lecture is about? And question mark. Then we have C. What are we doing today? Okay, and for that, what will I say, you guys? I can say, do you know? Do you know what we are doing today? Okay, indirect question. And then we have D. How did you do the assignment? Okay, how can I go about this? I'll probably say, can you tell me how you did the assignment? Okay. Then we have E. Why is this important? And for that, I'll say, have you got any idea why this, or I wrote that wrong, why this is important? Okay? And let's go to F. When does the course start? Do you know when? Do you know when the course starts? When the course starts. Okay? Then we have G. Who's teaching the course? again, we'll just use have you got any idea? I want you guys to remember I'm using phrases from here. So have you got any idea? Do you know? And can you tell me? Okay? So G, have you got any idea who's short for who is, who's teaching? So who's teaching the course? Okay? Question mark. And finally, H, how much does this book cost? For that, I'll use can you tell me? Why did I write an X there? So, can you tell me how much this book costs? Question mark. That was not a question mark. Okay. Okay, you guys? So, indirect questions using these phrases. Can you tell me if the lecture is about Piaget? Have you got any idea who the lecture is about? Do you know what we're doing today? Can you tell me how you did the assignment? Have you got any idea why this is important? Do you know when the course starts? Have you got any idea who's teaching the course? And finally, can you tell me how much this book costs? Okay? So I hope you guys now understand and are able to turn direct questions into indirect ones and vice versa. Now, let's keep going. Do we have anything down here? No, we don't. Let's go above. We have H, identifying a new skill. What kind of word can come after the verb forget? So, let's go to skills check 3 so we can figure that out. So, verb patterns. Several patterns can follow some verbs. So, we have, for example, I forgot, right? So, forgot, verb, past. I forgot the telephone number. That's noun, simple. I forgot to return the books, infinitive plus noun. Okay? I forgot about the meeting, preposition and noun. Okay? And finally, I forgot how to use the app. So here we actually have a question word, how, and then infinitive, and finally a noun. Okay? So I just want to let you know that if you know the possible patterns after a verb, so these patterns, you can, with a little bit of practice, you can predict the possible endings to a sentence, right? So if we're having a talk and we're talking about a phone number or a telephone number, and you say I forgot, I kind of already know what you're gonna say, as in I forgot the or you forgot the telephone number. Okay? So what kind of word can come after the verb forget? Don't forget the telephone number. Don't forget to return the books again. Don't forget about our meeting, and don't forget how to use the book, for example, right? So all of these are correct. Now let's go to practicing a new skill 3. Here we have I, exercise I. Listen to the beginning of some sentences and choose the best way to complete each sentence. And let me actually open this so you guys can get a better view. Okay, so we're gonna listen to some sentences and then we're gonna choose from these the best way to complete each sentence. So here, have a listen.
Track 1.7.
1. At school, we learnt about. 2. Don't forget. 3. I remember. 4. I'd like to learn how. 5. My tutor is very nice. She reminds me of. 6. My tutor usually reminds me about.
Alright, let me play that one more time, but this time we'll be choosing the best way to complete each one as we go. Here we go.
Track 1.7.
1. At school, we learnt about.
The countries of the region. That just seems the most fitting.
2. Don't forget.
To hand in the assignment on time. Okay?
3. I remember.
Getting my first bicycle. So, the countries of the region, to hand in the assignment on time, and getting my first bicycle.
4. I'd like to learn how.
To cook.
5. My tutor is very nice. She reminds me of...
My mother.
6. My tutor usually reminds me about...
Seminar dates. Okay, that was a simple exercise, basically practicing the new skill of verbs and their patterns. Okay, so now let's go to exercise J. Really simple exercise here, you guys. Here we have using forget, remember, remind, and learn. So we're going to use the words in brackets to complete each sentence, and we're going to have to make some necessary changes. Okay, so here we have 1. I forgot, and we have the word give, her the message. So how would we go about saying this, you guys? Yes, we'll say I forgot to give her the message. Okay? And then let's go to number 2. She remembered put dash her phone in her handbag, but it wasn't there. Always read the full sentence, by the way. When solving any of these questions, before writing it down, just read the whole sentence. It might change your perspective, and you might make a mistake if you don't read the full sentence. Okay? So, I remembered putting her phone in her handbag, but it wasn't there. 3. I learned how, then we have swim, when I was very young. This one's pretty simple. I learned how to swim when I was very young. And then we have number 4. He reminds me, word, dash his father. And for that we'll say, he reminds me, and then we'll add of. So he reminds me of his father. Then we have 5. Did you remember take dash that library book back? So that's a question, so we'll say, did you remember to take that library book back? And then we have 6. Remind me, call dash him when we get home. Again, we'll use to call. So, remind me to call him when we get home. And then finally we have 7. I've forgotten how dash this machine. Again, how to, and then the verb, use this machine. Okay, you guys? So I forgot to give her the message. She remembered putting her phone in her handbag, but it wasn't there. I learned how to swim when I was very young. He reminds me of his father. Did you remember to take that library book back? Remind me to call him when we get home. I've forgotten how to use this machine. Okay? So I think this is it, you guys. So this was listening of theme 1, and I'll see you in the next one.